So Mark Carney just publicly mocked Donald Trump at a G7 press conference. Not behind closed doors, not through a spokesman, not in a calculated diplomatic statement released hours later, through carefully managed channels, standing at a podium with every major world leader present, with cameras broadcasting live to every country on Earth. The Prime Minister of Canada looked in the direction of the President of the United States and delivered a line that made the entire room, heads of state diplomats, the International Press Corps, laugh at him. The footage went viral within hours, viewed over 90 million times before Trump's plane had even left the summit, trending #1 in 43 countries, and generating a wave of memes, screenshots, and reaction compilations that have already become the defining image of this presidency's relationship with the rest of the democratic world. Trump's response wasn't measured. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't the controlled counterpunch of a leader who understood how to manage the moment. It was rage, visible, public, unrestrained, and every word of it confirmed exactly what Carney had implied. Warren Buffett said Carney just inflicted a kind of damage that no tariff, no trade deal, and no diplomatic maneuver in the history of this confrontation has managed to inflict. The kind of damage that doesn't show up in economic data, but that changes the calculus of every future interaction between the United States and the rest of the democratic world. But it's the specific line Carney used and the 2 seconds of silence before the room erupted that tells you this wasn't a spontaneous joke. This was a strategic execution disguised as humor. And when you see the setup, the delivery, the reaction, Trump's response, and what Buffett says this means for American authority going forward, you'll understand why 13 seconds of footage from a press conference podium may have done more damage to the American presidency than 2 years of tariffs, trade wars, and diplomatic crisis combined. Hit subscribe because the footage is still spreading and the diplomatic consequences haven't peaked. Let me take you through exactly how this happened, because the setup matters as much as the moment. And what Trump said in the hours before the press conference is what made Carney's line land like a detonation. The G7 summit in Puglia had been tense from the opening session. The trade war between the United States and its allies had dominated every bilateral meeting, every working dinner, every corridor conversation for the entire 3-day gathering. Trump arrived with the posture he had carried into every international forum for 2 years: aggressive, transactional, openly dismissive of the multilateral framework that the G7 was designed to represent. He had spent the first 2 days of the summit publicly berating European leaders over defense spending, threatening new tariffs on Japanese automobiles, and telling reporters in a hallway gaggle that the G7 was a waste of time unless these countries start showing some respect for what America does for them. The other leaders had responded with a practiced diplomatic restraint that had become the default mode for engaging with Trump at international summits. Polite disagreement, calibrated statements, private frustration expressed only to trusted staff behind closed security doors. Macron had been characteristically pointed but measured. MS had been firm but formal. The British Prime Minister had said almost nothing publicly, choosing strategic silence over confrontation. But in the working sessions, the closed-door meetings where cameras are excluded and leaders speak with something closer to candor, the atmosphere had been deteriorating for 3 days. Multiple diplomatic sources described a dynamic in which Trump dominated conversations not through argument, but through volume and repetition, dismissing counterarguments not by engaging with them, but by talking over the person making them and treating the other leaders in the room not as equals, conducting shared governance, but as subordinates receiving instructions. And then during the final working session on the morning of the last day, Trump said something about Canada that multiple people in the room later described as the moment the tone changed irreversibly. The session was nominally about trade coordination, and Carney had been presenting Canada's position on supply chain resilience, a detailed data-driven framework that had taken his team months to prepare. Trump interrupted the presentation 14 minutes in. He didn't challenge the data. He didn't offer a counter-argument. He looked around the table at the other leaders and said, "Nobody cares what Canada thinks about trade. Canada is a small country that's lucky we buy anything from them at all. If it weren't for the United States, nobody in this room would even know where Canada is." The room went silent. Not the silence of agreement, the silence of leaders who had just heard something so gratuitously dismissive that the normal machinery of diplomatic response couldn't process it quickly enough to produce a reaction. Carney said nothing. His expression didn't change. His posture didn't shift. According to 3 people who were watching him directly, he looked at Trump for approximately 4 seconds with an expression that one Canadian diplomat later described as the quietest fury I've ever seen on a human face. And then he returned his gaze to his notes and continued his presentation as though the interruption had not occurred. He finished the presentation. He answered questions from other leaders. He participated in the remaining discussion items, and he gave no visible indication, none, that anything unusual had happened or that anything unusual was about to happen. Behind the scenes, the Canadian delegation was in motion. Carney's chief of staff pulled aside the communications director during the coffee break and said 6 words. He's going to respond at the presser. The communications team began preparing not talking points, not a rebuttal framework, not the standard diplomatic response package that would normally be assembled after a provocation of this magnitude. They prepared for something they had never prepared for before in the context of a G7 summit. A comedic moment. Carney had told his senior advisor during a private conversation between sessions that Trump's comment had clarified something he had been considering for months, that the era of treating this president with the diplomatic respect normally afforded to the office was over because the person holding the office had made it clear repeatedly, publicly, and now on the floor of a G7 working session that he did not extend that respect to anyone else. The decision Carney made in that moment was not to escalate, it was to demote. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. And then came the press conference. The setting was the standard G7 configuration, a row of podiums arranged in a gentle arc, each bearing the flag and nameplate of a member nation. The international press corps assembled in tiered seating, cameras from every major network in the world trained on the stage. The atmosphere was tense but routine. The closing press conference of a contentious summit expected to produce carefully worded statements about areas of agreement in diplomatic language papering over areas of disagreement. Trump spoke first, as the host nation's prerogative had been waived in favor of alphabetical rotation that placed the United States early in the order. His remarks were characteristically self-congratulatory. He declared the summit a tremendous success, claimed credit for agreements that had been negotiated before his arrival, and described the other leaders as very impressed with what America has achieved under my leadership. He made no reference to his earlier comments about Canada. He appeared to have moved on entirely, unaware that the moment he had created was still alive and about to be detonated. Carney's turn came 40 minutes into the press conference. His opening remarks were unremarkable. A summary of Canada's positions on climate cooperation, supply chain coordination, and Arctic governance delivered in the measured, slightly dry tone that had become his diplomatic signature. He thanked the host nation. He acknowledged areas of productive discussion. He used the phrase constructive engagement twice. Nothing in his demeanor, his tone, or his language suggested that anything other than a standard closing statement was underway. The press corps, many of whom had been covering summits for decades, showed the glazed patience of professionals waiting for the Q&A portion where actual news might be made. Then a Reuters journalist asked the question, Prime Minister Carney, President Trump suggested earlier today that Canada's role in global trade is insignificant. What is your response? The question was direct but expected. Journalists routinely ask leaders to respond to provocative statements from other leaders at these events, and the expected answer is a dignified rebuttal emphasizing the strength of bilateral relations and the importance of mutual respect. Carney paused. The pause was notable. It lasted approximately 3 seconds, long enough for the press corps to look up from their notebooks, long enough for cameras to tighten their framing, long enough for the other leaders on stage to glance in his direction. He tilted his head slightly. The faintest suggestion of amusement crossed his face. Not a smile, not a smirk, but a shift in expression that the front row of journalists later described as the moment they knew something unprecedented was about to happen. The president says Canada is too small to matter, Carney said. His tone was conversational, almost gentle, the kind of tone you'd use to describe something mildly puzzling rather than deeply offensive. He paused again, 1 second, maybe 2, and yet somehow he spent 2 years talking about nothing else. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the room broke. Laughter, genuine, uncontrolled, involuntary laughter erupted from the press corps, from the diplomatic staff seated along the walls, and most devastatingly, from the other leaders on stage. Macron turned his head away from the cameras, but not quickly enough to hide the grin. MS closed his eyes and pressed his lips together in the universal expression of a person trying desperately not to laugh and failing. The British Prime Minister looked down at her podium with her shoulders shaking. The Japanese Prime Minister covered his mouth with his hand. The Italian Prime Minister made no attempt to hide his reaction and laughed openly, loudly, directly into his microphone. Trump's face was captured by, treated the moment as unremarkable, as though mocking the President of the United States was such a natural response to his behavior that it required no special acknowledgement, no dramatic follow-up, no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred. The mockery was not the climax of Carney's press conference. It was an aside. And that casualness communicated something more cutting than the words themselves. In the moment that Trump's behavior had made him so easy to mock that doing so barely warranted interrupting one's prepared remarks. And then Trump responded. And his response did the only thing that could have made the moment worse. It proved Carney right. Within 30 minutes of the press conference ending, Trump posted on social media, calling Carney a failed banker who couldn't run a lemonade stand, the worst leader in Canadian history, and a desperate, jealous little man from a country that would be nothing without the United States. He called the other leaders who had laughed weak and disrespectful. He threatened immediate tariff increases on Canadian goods. He told reporters on the tarmac before boarding Air Force One that Carney was finished and that Canada will pay a very big price for what happened today. Every word of the response confirmed the mockery's thesis that this was a leader who could not absorb a moment of humor without erupting into the kind of disproportionate rage that made the original joke look not just funny, but prophetic. The mockery said, "This man is too easy to provoke to be taken seriously." The response said, "Yes, exactly." Behind the scenes, the White House was in damage control mode, and the damage control effort was itself becoming a source of damage. Senior advisors had urged restraint before the social media posts went out. One reportedly told the president that the only way to beat a joke is to not react to it, and was overruled within minutes. The communications team drafted 3 different official responses, each more measured than what the president ultimately said, and each was rejected in favor of the unfiltered rage that had already been posted. Staff members described an atmosphere in the traveling delegation that one official later called the worst I've seen in 2 years, worse than the tariff backlash, worse than the diplomatic severance, worse than any of it, because this one was personal, and he knew it. The second viral wave hit within hours of Trump's response. Side-by-side compilations of Carney's calm delivery and Trump's furious reaction, set against the audio of the room laughing, edited into clips that made the contrast inescapable. These compilations were shared even more widely than the original clip because they told a complete story in under 30 seconds. Provocation, mockery, laughter, rage, confirmation. The internet had been given the perfect narrative arc, and it did what the internet always does with a perfect narrative arc. It spread it everywhere to everyone permanently. The structural trap that Carney had laid was now fully visible, and it was a trap with no exit. Silence in response to the mockery would have looked like submission, an acceptance that the joke was valid and that no response was available. Rage in response to the mockery looked like confirmation, proof that the characterization of Trump is easily provoked and unable to handle being laughed at was accurate. A dignified, measured response would have required the one quality that the entire confrontation had been designed to demonstrate was absent: composure under social pressure. There was no good option, and there was no good option by design. Carney had not just mocked Trump. He had constructed a situation in which every possible response to the mockery made the mockery more effective. Silence, rage, or dignity. Each path led to the same destination: the reinforcement of the image of a leader who could not operate on a stage where he was not feared. And this is where the story shifts from a viral moment into something with permanent structural consequences. Because mockery does something to power that no tariff, no sanction, no diplomatic severance, and no trade war can do. Every previous weapon in this confrontation, the tariffs, the energy suspensions, the diplomatic ruptures, the bilateral deals designed to exclude American participation, attacked American interests. They caused economic damage, strategic damage, diplomatic damage, but they left American authority intact. A nation can absorb economic pain and retain its standing. A nation can lose a trade war and remain respected. A nation can even lose an ally and maintain its position in the global hierarchy. What a nation cannot absorb, what no leader and no institution has ever recovered from,